Hi everyone, welcome to twinportschess.com. This is Grandmaster Mauricio Flores, and I will be playing at the Twin Ports Chess Open between August 15th and August 16th. And I'd like to invite all of you to register, and I'll see you there. Now today I want to make this video to illustrate how the pawn structure determines the strategy of the game. And I will do that by showing you a recent game about 10 days ago. This was played between Liang Awander and Han Kuran in the 2015 US Junior Closed Championship in St. Louis. So let's start to see the game. So the game turned out to be a King's Indian defense. White shows a Samish variation with some small modifications, like placing this bishop on g5 instead of the more usual bishop e3. And now Black chose to place his pawns with a flexible setup, which in my book is called a King's Indian complex. It's a King's Indian complex because, well, the pawns have an undefined pawn structure at the moment, and many things can happen. So, for example, White could take d takes e5, and after d takes e5, we have one type of position with a very specific set of plans. Another option would be for White to play d5 and Black replies c5. That would be another type of position. And then the other option is Black may take on d4, and then after White takes with the knight, we have another type of position. All of them have different plans. Now today I will show you one of them. So let's continue with the game. Rook d1, queen a5, and d5. This is a good move. So far I think Black's move order in the opening was not 100% precise, and because of that White already has a small advantage. Now having a small advantage is typically not enough unless you are able to make that a more material advantage. So this is what White is aiming to do. So he knows his pieces are placed a little better, and he will force Black to go into a inferior type of position. So he's transforming what used to be a not very clear position into a more well-defined position with a fixed pawn structure. That is the topic of today. So d5, and now Black could play c5. That would be the ideal reply in this position, but unfortunately the queen on a5 is not very well placed. So after knight b5, well, White is offering a queen trade, but the d6 pawn is falling. So for example, Black could play queen b6, protecting the pawn, knight c3, and now the threat is to play knight a4, forcing the queen to get kind of misplaced. And now White could reply with knight b8, right? And then knight a4 could be an option, but then, well, you see, knight a4 would be answered by queen d8, and now the pawn is defended. So instead we play bishop d3, and White has a dominating position. He has a lead in development, and he has more space. Now, going back to the game, White played d5, and Black chose to reply with c takes, and now White simply took on d5. And so what's going on now is that White, well, is offering to trade queens, threatening also, for example, if the queen were to move away, then simply take, and win a pawn, which is a pretty much decisive advantage in this position. So Black had to take, and after king takes, we have the position that we are interested in. So this is the pawn structure that I will talk about. In my book, this is called a King's Indian type 1 structure. Why? Because we have the typical King's Indian chain, and the c pawns have already been traded. Now what this means is, from the White side, having this pawn structure determines that we have more space. Having more space means we don't want to trade pieces, means we will have an easier time making maneuvers. It will be easier for us to play for a win. We will be probably the ones making the threats. Black will probably be the one defending, at least at first. And then for Black, what this means is, well, it's hard to move the pieces. Look at this bishop on g7, seems pretty useless at the moment. At the same time, look at this bishop on c8, it will take some moves to move it. And then the other key aspect is the c-file. If somebody can make a good use of the c-file, he will have a good position. In black's case, he will probably be enough for equality because he still has a significant space disadvantage because of this pawn. And for white, controlling the c-file will probably mean winning the game in one way or another, as we will see. If you look at a computer, for example, right now the computer might tell you, well, this position is about equal. But computers don't often understand very well the concept of a long-term advantage, which is what white has in this case. It's not the type of advantage that will help you to win a pawn or anything in the next 5 moves or so, but it's something that will be there. It's an element which will be present in the position for the next 20 moves, and little by little it will turn the balance in white's favor. It will prevent black from achieving some of his goals. It will allow white to maneuver more quickly. We will see in the game how this actually takes place. So right now there is an immediate threat, which is bishop e7, attacking the rook and the pawn. So black has to play f6. Now f5. f5 is a standard move, so there is nothing to comment. This is the right way that black should play in order to attack the e4 pawn. Now knight c3 is a good move. Supports the e4 pawn but also makes some threats. The threat is to play knight b5. Knight b5 is a strong move. Why? Because if the knight were to go to b5, it would attack the d6 pawn, the a7 pawn, and the c7 square. Okay, so kind of like this. It's a very strong move, and because of that, black has to cover the square by playing a6. Now, of course, playing a6 is a pawn move that covers one square but weakens another. In this case, the square that has been weakened is the b6 square. Now white played g4. Now there are people that may say that when you are being attacked on one side, it is not a good idea to move pawns on that side. But the truth is, in this particular position, white has a very significant space advantage, and playing g4 only helps to increase that advantage. Now white is not planning to take on f5 necessarily. He's not planning to do this. What he really wants to do is maybe to play g5 and h4, so he can have a lot of space. This is the idea. Because you see, if he waits, he plays something like rook c1, for example, the game might continue with f4, g5, and suppose we make some careless moves now. So bishop d3, h5, knight f6, and suddenly black has something to play for. He has gained some substantial space in the queen side, and he's actually doing fairly well. g4 then is the correct move, preventing black from achieving that expansion. And now there are a couple of options. So f4. f4 would be to say, well, I want to expand on the king side anyway. So I play bishop f2, bishop f6, h4. And now a typical maneuver for black is to activate this bishop, which is pretty useless in g7. So bishop d8 is a good move. The idea is to bring the bishop to b6 or maybe a5. Either way, the bishop will become a useful piece, but after rook c1, white maintains the control of the game. So what's really happening here is white has more space. Then again, black may, try some things like bishop b6, but he will never be able to remove the fact that he has less space. So after a4, for example, bishop d7, a5, and move the knight away, white's position is just very pleasing. He dominates him. He will probably be able to start attacking with rook c7. Now, pawn takes is the other option, and then black's third option is to play knight f6. Knight f6 is probably a good idea. The reason is that with knight f6 we are able to maintain the tension. Maintaining the tension is often good because it prevents your opponent from making long-term decisions. Now, if he doesn't know what's going to happen with this pawn structure, how can he know what line he has to follow? So in that sense, keeping the tension can be a good idea. And now white could simply play h3, keeping the tension then again. If he were to take on f5 instead, after some moves it may become apparent that black is gaining some counterplay, and that's not the kind of thing that we want to do. So you want to keep your opponent with as few attacking moves as possible. So pawn takes. Now there are two open files, but unfortunately for black he is unable to make use of neither. So for example, he could play rook f3. It doesn't make any sense because after a simple move like bishop g2, the rook simply has to go away. And after a move like g5, the knight or any piece can come to f6, limiting, for example, look at this knight. Both squares are covered, so basically the knight is useless. Now in this position, black, in my opinion, should have continued with knight f6. And the idea is that if I push now, then knight h5 allows some pretty good counterplay for black. Then I will be coming to f4 pretty soon, and then, well, who knows what will happen. I think white is still a little better, but most of the advantage is gone. So the right move would be h3, covering the squares. But now black can just play bishop d7, place a rook on f7 to kind of keep an eye both on this open line and the weak square, which is very important to cover. And then we could have a position like this, and now white can try something like knight a4. The idea of knight a4 is to go for the weak square, and after bishop takes and pawn takes, white enjoys a small advantage. So he has double pawns, which in some sense change the nature of the position, but at the same time he has a very promising position because well, he has a pair of bishops, he has more space, the b7 pawn is weak, etc. So bishop here black played bishop f6, and the idea is to transfer the bishop to a better location. So white just continued with his plan, bishop e2, and now b5. Now b5 is one of those double-edged moves which we have to think very carefully. The idea of playing b5 is to claim some space. You know, we don't want to be completely cramped, we want to have some space for our pieces to move. Unfortunately, whenever you play b5, some new weaknesses arise. Now let's see some of the options. One of the options was just waiting, which, as you may guess, will not work very well in the long term. Another option was to play g5. Why would somebody want to play g5? The idea is to play at some point knight f8, g6 and f4, where f4 would actually be a very nice square, a weak point in white's position. Unfortunately, white has some tactical resources to defeat this idea, which is to play h4 right away. Now after h4, black could take on h4, and after g5 the position is very, very bad for black. And the other option is to play h6, which is a little better, and after pawn takes and rook h5, we are winning a pawn. Now black may actually get some counterplay with this, you know, because the position becomes a little disorganized, the f4 square is still weak, you know, the knight might still be able to come to f4 someday in the future, but at least now white has secured an extra pawn. So let's go back to what happened in the game, which was b5. Now after b5, white knows that the b5 pawn will become very weak, so we can trade some pieces, and then the most important thing when there is a weakness is to fix the weakness. So you play b4, very good move, and after you have played b4, the b5 pawn is fixed there forever, right? So our b4 pawn stops the pawn from moving, and then we can start attacking the pawn. That's the idea. So bishop c8, do we want to trade pieces? No, because what does the strategy tell us? The strategy says we have more space, right? Our pawns are more advanced, and because of that, we want to keep as many pieces as possible because we have an easier time moving our pieces around. And this is when things become a little more clear. So bishop e2. Well, what does bishop e2 do? It aims in the direction of the weak pawns. So now both the a6 and the b5 pawn are serious targets. The idea is to at some point play, well, the simple move a4. That's the idea. So bishop d7 and now rook c1. There is no hurry, right? We could play something like rook a1, hoping to play a4 next move, but you know, if we play a4, then maybe the b4 pawn, right, our b4 pawn will become weak. So instead it is best to just keep an eye on the multiple options that we have. For example, another opportunity that white could try is to play knight d1, knight f2, then bishop g4, and after the bishops are traded, now that we control the c file, we could put a rook on the weak square c6. So black has to deal with a lot, and in this position he decided he wanted to create some counterplay with a5. Now a5 is actually a relatively bad move. The reason is that after you play a5, you change the pawn structure in a bad way, because now the b5 pawn doesn't have a natural protection. So all that white has to do is hold the pawn on b4, and now the b5 pawn is weaker than it was before. So king f7 and now rook b1. The idea of rook b1 is simple. We want to prepare for a couple more moves to take on a5 and then win the b5 pawn. So for example, if black waited with king g8, white could play king d1 to get out of this ugly line, and then the threat is to take on a5. And now the game could have also continued, you know, in this position when we are attacking the b5 pawn. The game could have also continued with a takes b4 and a takes b4. This is another option, but unfortunately for black, he has to defend the b5 pawn, which means the only person who can really take advantage of the open file is white. He obviously doesn't want to deal with that, so he played a4 instead. Now, what's bad about a4? The pawn on a4 is a lot worse than it was on a6. The pawn on a6 used to protect the weak pawn on b5. The pawn on a4 is actually a target. So suppose in some near future we will be able to capture the pawn on b5, suddenly the pawn on a4 will be lost as well. It will be defenseless. So a4 and now knight d1. Now white, all he has to do is shuffle his pieces around, find the best location for everything, and from that he will be able to win this game. So let's see how it continues. So knight c3, okay, kind of holding on to this pawn, so knight has to go back to f8. And now it's becoming more and more clear that white is actually going to win this game. So what happened now is, well, rook c1, attacking, taking control of this very important square, and all that black can do is wait. Now let me show you a variation just to illustrate black's problem. So for example, he could have played rook b6, kind of to fight off this rook on c6, but unfortunately after trading rooks and knight f6, white is winning a pawn, right? The h7 pawn is lost. And when the h7 pawn is lost, the game is going to be lost as well. So let me show you. So king e7, knight takes, then we bring the king obviously, and then h5, very good move. Next move, king h4, and then what happens is, after this trade, the position is just desperate for black. Like we are going to bring the king to g4, try to get through f5 somehow. We can maneuver back with this knight. Maybe I should add a couple of moves. So king f7, I can play now knight g4, king here, take, knight e3, and now the black is tied. The black knight is tied to the defense of his very weak d6 pawn, so the king has to move away, and the king comes in. Next move, he will play king h6 and push the pawn decisively. So this is what happens when black tries to fight off this rook on c6. So instead he played king e7, following a waiting strategy, but obviously this is not something that can work for very long. So after knight f6 we already see that his position is collapsing, right? So knight f6 is attacking the h7 pawn, and now black has to do something about this. So he could, for example, play h5, that would be an option, but then white can take on e8, take on b5, and this is a decisive advantage. Next move, he will be able to take on a4, and 2 pawns is enough to win in most positions. Now another option was to play knight d7, and now white can just take on e8 and take on d6. Soon he will go back with his rook to a6, a5, and both the b5 and a4 pawn will be lost as well. So knight c8, and now white simply played rook a8, winning a piece. So what's going on right now is that, well, black could play, for example, rook c7, but after bishop g4 the knight has to go away, and suddenly the bishop on e8 is lost. So black played bishop d7, and after knight takes, black resigned. And the reason is that when black takes with the king, bishop g4 wins a piece. Now to summarize what happened in this game, I would say that Liang, a wonder with white, played a very good positional game. I don't think black made any very serious mistakes other than going into a very inferior structure from the early game. I have played this structure myself with black many times, and the truth is I always lost in a very similar way to how Han Kuran lost. Basically you just wait around, you don't have enough space, and you get your pieces squeezed, and you really have nothing to do. So what I would say is very important to remember from this game is that the pawn structure determined everything that happened in the game. White's pawn structure gave him some very substantial space advantage. You see, if you compare these two pawns with these two pawns, you can see white really has a substantial advantage, and then this little advantage in one side of the board allows him to expand on other sides. Like, for example, look at this g5 pawn. Okay, we were able to get that g5 pawn in there, and that allows us to claim some more squares. You see later in the game having this g5 pawn was essential because it allowed the knight to come decisively on these squares. So overall, I would say that the message to take away from here is that a pawn structure determines the plans, and determines what plans are good, what plans are bad. It allows you to know which squares are worth attacking, which squares need to defend. So well, that's all I would like to say for today. I wanted to again thank you for visiting twinportschess.com, and I hope I will see you at the Twin Ports Chess Open. So goodbye.